decades, Washington's economic institutions have failed the American people. The Federal Reserve claimed it could see the future, yet its projections were always wrong. The IRS was supposed to collect taxes. Instead, it was turned into yet another political weapon. Ordinary Americans paid the price, but under President Trump, that era is finally ending. And Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is at the center of the transformation. Working double duty as acting IRS commissioner, he's rebuilding the agency to protect taxpayers rather than harass them. Bessent's also helping President Trump tackle maybe an even greater challenge, selecting the next Federal Reserve chairman. And while current Fed Chief Jerome Powell finally seems to be catching up to calls to lower interest rates, America simply can't afford another bureaucrat chained to failed models. It needs someone aligned with the growth agenda that's already bringing factories home, generating billions in tariff revenue, and delivering results. But I'll let the secretary explain.
Secretary Scott Bessent, thank you so much for joining us on My View. There's a lot of talk about the Fed chair, Jerome Powell. You've said that you think the next Fed chair must be independent and forward-looking. So what qualities would you be particularly looking for in addition to that for the next person to potentially serve in that role?
This is one of the most important selections that the president's going to make. And there are really three parts to the job. There's monetary policy, there's regulatory policy, and there's the administration of the Federal Reserve System. So you're, in essence, the CEOs. But what we're really looking for is someone who's open-minded. I think we're on the cusp of a big AI productivity boom. So I'd like to see someone with an open mind who's thinking about the future rather than the past. Markets live in the future, and I think a lot of what we've seen from monetary policy over the past few years has been backward-looking. If our models aren't working, if we are always late, if we have all these economists, to what end if the decisions are bad? The Fed publishes something called the Summary of Economic Projections, and they do that 4 times a year. And I can't tell you, they're always off. When I had my private firm, one of the best investment strategies was actually trading against the Fed.
Oh, wow. You, of course, in addition to Treasury Secretary, are acting IRS head. So what's priority for getting the agency back to running at peak efficiency?
My 3 goals are collections, privacy, and customer service. And I think the IRS has fallen down on all those. You know, we saw a weaponized IRS for many years, and you know, we can't have that, whichever side of the political aisle you're on. It's leaned, unfortunately, more against those on the right, but we are going to get back to a very efficient agency. We want people to understand the amount of taxes that they should be paying and not to overpay. We want them to feel comfortable with the system. So that's going to be the priority on day one.
You know, it's interesting to hear you talk about the weaponization. So what is it you can do to regain the trust of the American people and ensure that, you know, tax law is enforced fairly, but there's no political bend to anything happening at the agency?
Well, I think we've seen it across the IRS. I think we saw it in the banking industry, and personnel is policy. So I think that the IRS, the commissioner, the senior leadership are all going to be tasked with that. They have put in some fantastic new banking regulators, and I can already hear from the community banks that there is a difference in tone. We need to do some kind of an examination of how did this happen, why did it happen, and make sure it never happens again.
You have seen the United States bring in $150 billion from the tariffs. And, you know, initially there was so much made of how would this go. Do you feel like this is finally confirmation that the way this administration has gone about trade, tariffs, and leveling the playing field is finally working?
I think it's exactly as you said. And you're starting to see in the mainstream media, whether it's the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, that Even the other side, or the super free market, people are getting addicted to tariff income. I've been saying 300 billion, but I think it could be much higher. Every 300 billion is 1% of GDP. We got left with a mess in terms of the deficit to GDP, the highest ever when we weren't in a recession, weren't at war. So just with the tariff income, we're going to be in the fives, which is incredible. Like that's like running a marathon and starting 5 miles before everybody else.
Of course, you have critics, and they will say that the tariffs are a hidden tax on the consumers here in the country. But give us the reality.
If they're so bad, and the American consumers paying them, why do we hear the European companies or the Chinese companies or the Chinese complaining about tariffs if it's all being borne by the American people? It's just not happening. When I talk about President Trump's economic policy, I describe it as a three-legged stool: trade, tax, and deregulation. So either we take in the income, or the companies bring their factories back to the U.S. And I can tell everyone, he's equally happy with both. He likes the income, but he wants to reindustrialize. And, these jobs that are coming back, studies have shown that the way to middle-class prosperity is through good-paying, precision manufacturing jobs. And when I look at these companies that want to come in, that it's incredible.
Well, one of the great American companies that we've seen really investing in the United States right now is Apple. Apple is pledging $600 billion of manufacturing. That is huge for the United States.
Apple used to say, well, we designed it in California, but it was previously basically a Chinese manufacturing assembler. Then during COVID, China became an unreliable supplier. So they moved a lot of production to India, and now they're moving back. There's some new kind of glass for the frame that they're using. All that glass is going to be made in a factory in Kentucky and exported to the rest of the world. And I think the Apple model is a great model.
When you look back years from now, what will tell you that the trade work that was done during this term was a success?
That's a great question. Is, a decade later, how will the U.S. have been changed for the better? How will Main Street have prospered? And we can look back into the early 2000s and think about the China shock. And that was obviously a downside for working Americans. Maybe we'll look back in 20 years, people will be writing about the Trump shock, but it was an upside surprise that we brought back this manufacturing base. We rebalanced our trading relationships, that we have fair trade, not this unfettered free trade. So I think we will look back and think that we didn't decouple from China, but we de-risked, that we have brought back manufacturing, and that Main Street Americans have done great.
Well, just to wrap up here, tell me about working with President Trump. President
Trump is optimistic, he's open-minded, and he's determined. And I tell everyone, it's 21/7. I said there's a 3-hour window when I can go into REM sleep, hopefully. The Treasury building's part of the White House campus. I am 0.25 miles away. I can see the Oval from my office. It takes me exactly, not that I ever have to run over, but occasionally.
If you have to.
If I have to. It takes exactly 4.5 minutes. But the really special thing for me is I go through the East Wing entrance, and that's where the visitors come in. So when I am zipping through there, I get to see the Americans. I get to see these people who have just come to D.C. to see how their government works. And it's a constant reminder for me that that's who we're working for.